following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and it's my privilege to introduce another episode of The Packaged Tourist, hosted by the Packaged Tourist in the magical mystery tour called Life, Matthew DiBiase.
Thank you, Ralph. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, our featured guest is author Todd Denault. For the past 10 years, Todd has been a brilliantly creative contributor to the annals of hockey literature. In 2010, he won the face-off with the definitive biography of Montreal Canadiens goaltending immortal Jacques Plante. His examination of Plante's life, hockey career, and his innovative approach to goaltending was praised by Sports Illustrated as, I quote, engaging, and the Montreal Gazette as, and I quote, complete, well-researched portrait of a complex man, unquote, as indeed Plante was. In 2011, Todd followed up that opus with a power play second effort titled The Greatest Game, a thrilling account of the life and death stalemate between the Montreal Canadiens and the Soviet Red Army team on New Year's Eve 1975. The Greatest Game was critically acclaimed by HockeyBookReviews.com as, and I quote, one of the most important hockey books ever written, unquote. Not content with two wonderfully brilliant works, in 2012, Todd Denault scored a hat trick when he released his greatest work, A Season in Time, a glorious examination of the 1992-93 NHL season, which was the last time a Canadian NHL team won the Stanley Cup, with fascinating stories about Wayne Gretzky, Mario Lemieux, and Patrick Roy, who, along with their teammates and coaches, carried their teams to the Stanley Cup playoffs. The Toronto Sun stated that A Season in Time is, and I quote, simply put, one of the best hockey books ever written since Ken Dryden's The Game and Roy McGregor's Home Game, unquote. I would like to personally state that A Season in Time is not only a masterpiece of hockey literature, but also of sports literature as a whole. It is a perfect example of what sports literature should always be. 4 years later, he collaborated with Mike Brophy with his latest work, Unbreakable, 50 Goals in 39 Games, their account of Wayne Gretzky's 81-82 season where he set the record for scoring 50 goals in the fastest time. Todd, please tell us about your background. Where were you born and raised?
Thank you for the kind words, Matt. I was born on November 20th, 1974 in Etobicoke, Ontario. And then when I was about, 11 months old, I moved to Cobourg, Ontario, and Cobourg's been my home ever since. So a lot of people even think I was born in Cobourg, but in fact, the first 11 months were away from here. But born and raised in Cobourg, Ontario, which for those listening is about probably an hour east of Toronto.
Todd, when you were growing up, who were your favorite authors? Who did you like to read? And of those favorite authors, which one kind of inspired you to become a writer in your own right?
Ooh, wow. So to kind of flash back, I was a big reader as a kid. I know a lot of the kids, when you're younger, kids collected toys and Star Wars and all that stuff, and I was a book kid. So in terms of books, it started out with sports books. The first real sports book, or the first book that I can really remember as a kid, I mean, we're talking maybe when I was 12 or 13, that had a real effect on me, was Robert Creamer's 1974 biography of Babe Ruth, The Legend Comes to Life. That was like the first real book that I went, wow. And just, I mean, I could go on. Like, it pretty much started with baseball books. Roger Kahn, Boys of Summer, was a big influence. And then, of course, hockey, I mean, the biggest influence, and I'm probably not all that out of the ordinary for most people, was Ken Dryden's The Game. That book, even to this day, I mean, to me, it's the gold standard of hockey books. A person who's there in the arena playing in it, but also a writer at the same time, an observer. He's there, but he's somehow detached. It's the top book. I mean, there's other great hockey books. I mean, Peter Zosky's The Game of Our Lives is one that popped up when I was younger. And then as you get older, you branch out, you start reading other books. I'm a big history buff. So, I can just name off the top of my head David McCullough, David Halberstam, Robert Caro, just even off the top of my head, I think we all have those authors that, pay a big influence. So, I guess if you take all that together, that's what kind of influences you and, gives you the incentive that maybe, hey, I could maybe do this. Certainly not up to their level, but I'd like to give it a shot. So, there's countless people I probably haven't mentioned, but those would be the biggies for me.
At what age did you start to write?
I guess I started writing again when I was a kid. I can remember I still have this. My mother kept it, as mothers often do. I can remember as a kid, entering local poetry competitions, winning that. I was big on rhyming words, stuff like that. That was like a challenge to me. I can remember even in grade 6, I wrote like a series of short stories in school that basically were short stories. I think like a lot of people that revolved around my friends. Still have those. I just always kind of had the writing bug. Took creative writing courses, the whole thing. But I went to university at Carleton University in Ottawa. Got a degree in history, and that was really good in terms of learning how to properly research, write, structure, all that stuff. So that really had the biggest influence, even to this day, on my writing, was learning how to properly construct and to research, and I still do that today. That's still the template for everything I do.
One thing I noticed amongst your 3 of your 4 books, not counting Unbreakable, is that their first 3 books dealt with the Montreal Canadiens were always sort of prominently featured. Is it accurate to say you were a Montreal Canadiens fan growing up?
Yes, very accurate. I'll even share kind of something with you on this. So in some ways, as a huge Habs fan as a kid and growing up with Montreal, and my dad was a huge Montreal fan and my grandfather was a huge Montreal fan, kind of ingrained in you. In some ways, aside from who the titles are and all that, the first book, aside from being about Jacques Plante, also has a lot about the 50s Canadiens dynasty.
Ooh,
The second book, aside from, again, being about the New Year's Eve game, has a lot on the building of the 70s Canadiens dynasty.
Yep.
And then the third book basically tells the story in somewhat of the Montreal team that I grew up with. So for me, when I think of Montreal Canadiens growing up, I was too young to enjoy the 70s dynasty. I come in the early 80s. I come in when, Bob Gainey's the captain and Lafleur is kind of on his way out and Waugh's rookie year. Like, I come into the Montreal thing really in the, 83, 84, 85 era.
Yeah.
So that the third book kind of covers that for me.
When did you first conceive the idea of doing a biography of Jacques Plante?
I think like a lot of people, you're always searching for, what book do you want to do? So the funny part is I had the idea for the second book first. That book was in there for a long time. But in terms of the greatest game, I had that one in there for a while. But Jacques Plante actually came, ironically, a couple years before the book came out would be, so I guess November 1st, maybe 2007. I guess that was the anniversary night of him putting on the mask.
Wow.
And I remember they had a hockey game on TSN. I can still see it, where the intermission segment was on Jacques Plante. And they had the mask there on loan from the Hall of Fame. And I'm one of those people who, I'm a curious sort. Like, if I see something or whatever, I want to know more. So I went going, okay, I want to know more about Jacques Plante. And I looked around, and there was a couple books. I mean, we all know Andy O'Brien did a book with him in 71. There's also the goaltending instructional book. And there was a small French book that came out maybe in the 90s. And I just was like, Nobody's really done it. And then, like, the light bulb kind of went off that, that's the subject. This is the guy.
Are you like me? Sorry, Todd. Are you like me? I have this little motto that says, history abhors the vacuum. Do you have that same mentality? Do you like to fill vacuums?
I'm not. Yeah, I guess that's a good way to put it. I tend to think to myself, and it kind of maybe comes off as a little bit, pompous, but I kind of think to myself, I'm not interested in writing a book that somebody else has written. I want to write the book that people haven't written. So, like, a good example is like if somebody came up and said, oh, well, why don't you do a book on Bobby Orr or Gordie Howe? It's like, well, geez, that's been done. Is there a fresh angle there? Is there maybe an angle that hasn't been done, but the books have been done? So I'm one of those people, and all the power to people who think they can maybe perhaps better it or whatever. I tend to think who hasn't had a book done or why haven't they done, and that's when I get excited about doing something that hasn't been done.
Todd, please tell our younger listeners, why is Jacques Plante significant in the annals of NHL history? How exactly did Plante influence NHL goaltending?
Okay, so the easiest thing to tell people is anybody who goes to a hockey game, whether it's a kid's game or a junior game, an NHL game, any game, even a house league game, Jacques Plante's influence on goaltending is in that game. Everything that you see, from the mask, the protection, that is him. Beyond that even, little things taken for granted. Goalies coming out and playing the puck. Goalies talking to their defensemen. Goalies signaling for the icings. All these things. Plante is one of those rare individuals where he's literally the catalyst for a change in the way the game was played. So the only other person, in recent times, it would be the equivalent of like Bobby Orr for a defenseman, is Plante as a goalie.
The thing is, in your book, you talk about Plante's idiosyncrasies, and of course that led to misunderstandings with his coaches over the course of his career and all that. In a sense, was it a product of the times? In other words, if Plante were goaltending today, do you think his idiosyncrasies would be far better understood today? In other words, it was just people didn't understand back then. He was sort of like a way ahead of his times. How do you interpret his idiosyncratic behavior?
I don't know. He's one of those one of the more interesting aspects to me of his personality is his supreme confidence in himself and what he's doing. Rare is the person who could have all these people tell him he's doing something wrong, and he just shrugs it off. Like, it literally, other people's opinions or other people's thoughts did never play into his mind. Most people, like somebody, if you got criticized over and over again or somebody pointed things out, you may go, oh, geez. He never wavers like that. Like, he really does not criticism. He's so determined that he's right that it never somehow occurs to him that he could be wrong. And I think part of the problem for him in dealing with coaches is when you think you're smarter than the coach, or you're smarter than the coach, because let's be honest, there were no goalie coaches back then. There was no real focus on the goaltender. In some people's eyes, the goalie's job was to stop the puck, and that's how much we thought about it. Yeah. And if they didn't stop the puck, we'll find somebody who does. So he's the rare person who takes goalie from a position where it's a reactionary position, where they react to everything around them, and Plante's the guy who takes it to where he's moving forward. He's the guy, he's not standing waiting for the game to come to him. He's taking the whole game in. He's watching this. So he had no problem telling a defenseman, you're doing this wrong. You're not doing that right. You're not doing that right. Because he sees the game. He sees the whole ice. Whereas that would, of course, rankle people who would think, hey, your job is to stop the puck. And I think that's kind of the root of all of it. And, in the book, we focus a lot on the Toe Blake angle. I mean, Toe Blake and Plante, Plante's job was to stop the puck. And if he was having trouble or he was going through something, who does he have to turn to? He has nobody to turn to. It's going to cause friction because he doesn't think there's people there who understand him. Whereas today, totally different. Goalie coaches, video, all this stuff. I detail in the book, Plante spent hours in his hotel room every night writing out shooters' tendencies and, what this happened and all that. He was a student of the game in a time when there wasn't maybe as many students of the game as there would be, say, today.
Wow. If Jacques Plante were 18 years old today and it's about ready to be drafted in the NHL amateur draft, do you think he would still be a Hall of Fame goalie in today's NHL if he were 18 years old? What do you think?
Wow, that's a tough one because goaltending's changed so much in terms of, we went through the whole stage, and I detail this in the book, where Plante was not a real big supporter of the butterfly position finish. So I detail this in the book. He has an encounter near the end of his life with a young Patrick Waugh, who, again, when we're talking about goalies who are into their mindset and stubborn and they know what they're doing and they know how to do it, there's a lot of similarities there. And so Plante was very much a student of the game. It would have been interesting because he passes away just before the butterfly becomes the big thing that everybody goes to. Jacques Plante was what we would call an angle goalie and positioning and all that. I think he would have appreciated perhaps a Marty Brodeur goaltender as opposed to, say, a Dominic Hasek would have been fascinating to him because it was just so unorthodox and against everything. But I think if you wanted to look at somebody who may be closer to the Plante model, you'd be looking at Brodeur in terms of a modern big goalie.
Now, you stated earlier that you were working on The Greatest Game before you did the Jacques Plante book. Okay, when did you come up with the idea of doing The Greatest Game? What led you to that project, okay?
I'd always had, and I'm going back a long time, always had the thought that book, there was a game in terms of, I always say this, Jacques Plante was a biography. The Greatest Game is about an event. And Season in Time is about a year. So they're kind of different in that respect. So in terms of the event, New Year's Eve, Montreal and the Russians, so close to 72, the whole atmosphere around it. Even today, and it's on YouTube, the atmosphere around that game, the build-up, the tension, the anticipation, and then the cool part of it is for all of the hype and the build-up, it's one of those rare events where the game actually lives up to, if not exceeds, the hype.
Wow.
We have a lot of stuff today where it's the old, you see it a lot in sports where it's like, oh, this is going to be this and that, and then it's like, oh, it's a letdown. Yeah. That game, for whatever, people can debate whether it was the greatest game or what it meant and all that, but the one thing they can't debate is it wasn't a letdown. It was a hyped game, it was a big game, and it lived up to the expectations. So that's what drew me to that. The fact, too, of the fascination of the Russians versus the Canadians, like the international hockey, I think it's not a bad thing, but I think one of the things that's been lost since now everybody plays in the NHL, we're accustomed to seeing, Alexander Ovechkin versus Carey Price. It happens. It's hard to imagine back then. This was like a rare event. Tretiak had not faced, say, Ken Dryden since over 3 years before. It's unheard of today to think like that, and that's what kind of made it special. It's before, VCRs are popular. I guess the phrase would be, on that New Year's Eve, it was appointment night television. Got to watch this game.
Wow. How did the Montreal Canadiens players deal with the socio-political aspects of the game, in the build-up to the actual contest?
I think the interesting part is, and I detail this in the book, is there's the core of that team, and the core, by the core I mean Savard, Lapointe, Cournoyer, Peter Mahovlich. There was a core of guys who had played in 72. Dryden, obviously. That core had been there in 72. They'd been through it. They'd played the Russians in a series that was so beyond anything else, right? So the other guys, it was, I think for the whole team, I think for the Canadiens, this was like the test. Okay, how good are we here? We think we're a really good team. We think we're the best team in hockey. This is the test. Okay, we're going to play these guys. And for some of the people forget how young some of the Montreal players were. I mean, Larry Robinson's like in his third or fourth year. Bob Gainey's in his third year. Lafleur is in like his fifth year. This is their first big, they'd won the Cup in 73, but this is a different team. This is the test of how good are we. And even talking to the guys on the team, there was a sense when everything settled down after that game of going, okay, that was like the moment where they thought, okay, no, we're good. Like, we can play with anybody. And for them, that was the game in that respect where they thought, okay, because, I mean, even though it ended a 3-3 tie, they had the better of the play. And I think they thought to themselves, okay, this was the marker for them. We know we're good. And that's kind of how they approached that game.
Were you able to interview any of the Russian players who took part in that contest?
Okay, so kind of yes and kind of no. So I was fortunate in that there was a treasure. I had some friends who had been involved in, chronicling Russian hockey and all that. Yeah. And in there, if you can, and there's still kind of an untapped source, there's a bunch of stuff that's been written because these guys in Russian over in the Soviet Union chronicled their own team, right? Wow. So you would get guys who they'd talk to them about this game or that series. So I would get guys that way, where they would go, okay, I've got these interviews, I've translated them from Russian, so this is, Valery Vasiliev talking about that game, or this is Boris Mikhailov talking about that game. That's still kind of, to be honest with you, a real hint to somebody out there, kind of still an untapped source, that side of the story. The problem is trying to get a hold of, some of these guys, and unfortunately, all too many of them have already passed away. Yeah. And that makes it harder too, but I got enough, and then I was also fortunate, Frank Orr, the great Toronto Star writer, had done an interview with a bunch of guys on the team after that game, where he met them in the hotel, brought his tape recorder around, asked some questions, and he was very nice to Frank to share some of that with me. So I had enough, and then if you dig deep enough, you'd be amazed at what you can find. But it's tough to get a hold of those guys. Of course, everybody always asks. The one you wanted was Tretiak. Yeah, and it was tough. You try everything, and then you just kind of have to admit defeat. You can't get everybody all the time, as anybody else who's done a book unfortunately finds out. You want to get everybody, but sometimes for various reasons it doesn't quite work out.
Now, when the Flyers took them on, and that was after the New Year's Eve game, the Flyers, I recall, used a trapping and very ultra-physical play to defeat the Soviet team. Now, what was Montreal's tactical approach to taking on the Russians in that New Year's Eve game? What was their tactics?
Well, the big get for me for that book, I think it's probably the big get for most people, was being fortunate enough to spend hours talking with Scotty Bowman about that game. Wow. The build-up, the lead-up, players, his strategy. Like, people think, okay, it was an exhibition game. And it was labeled that. Scotty told me he started, and Scotty had prepared, because Scotty prepares for everything, but Scotty had really started focusing on that game 10 days before it happened, in terms of looking at the film, watching this, And the one, he had so many insights, but the one with regards to the game that sticks out is he was watching the game and he noticed, if you notice, the Russian defensemen, especially if somebody goes back and you watch the game they played against the Rangers, which was the game before the Montreal game. Yeah. The defensemen, especially in their own end, would not go in the corner for the puck. Ooh. So if you were a player in the corner and you had your back to the play, in the NHL you would be used to a forward defenseman coming in and challenging you, and he noticed that they didn't. So again, for Scotty in his mind, it was going, okay, they're not going to be in the corner, guys. You've got more time. They're not going to follow you there. Because they were not a team to play physical in the corners. And, of course, you got to keep in mind this is 75 in the NHL. Yeah. It's a very physical era. And he didn't he noticed that. There's a couple other things. The funny thing is, and again, off the top of my head, but it is in the book if you count it, I think Scotty in the first period, if I'm not mistaken, it may be, and I may be wrong because I'm trying to remember this, but used 18 different line combinations in the first period.
Wow. Jeez.
Like, people forget, he started the game, his forward line that starts the game is Guy Lafleur at center with Bob Gainey on left wing and Murray Wilson on right wing.
Ooh.
Like, he has Lafleur at center. He went through, and he's changing lines, and people, again, don't realize Scotty's not on a headset. He doesn't have anybody with him on the bench. Yeah. He's doing it all there. And as he told me, his thing was, we're going to show them things that they have never seen. So he's throwing out, if you watch the first period of that game, you will notice that the lines change. Almost every shift is different threes. It's never the same guys. It's total kind of like confusion. It's brilliant in a way if you have total confidence in your team and you have a great team where guys can do that. But, yeah, if you watch the opening face-off, it's Lafleur with Gainey and Murray Wilson. And, I mean, Lafleur at center with Gainey on his wing, I don't remember that happening too often back in the day.
Wow. Now, how difficult was it for Dryden and the Big Three to deal with the Soviet team's offensive? Was it very difficult? What were they doing, to protect their zone?
I loved. It's funny because when you talk to them, I love. There's the famous Dryden quote, especially on the Harlamov goal, that it was like we didn't see him, and then it's like he comes out of the ice and just emerges. Wow. They were so opportunistic, right? They only had 13 shots in the game, but of the 13 shots, 10 are probably high-quality scoring chances, right? They weren't about wasting shots, so that made it hard. And if you got complacent with them, I mean, I think one could make the argument, especially based around his 1972 play, that few defensemen the one defenseman of the 70s who maybe perhaps figured out the Russian style the best or was easily adapted to it or played it the best may have been Serge Savard. Because Serge thinks the game. He's a big guy and he's physical, but Serge thinks the game. Yeah. I think the funny thing about when you watch that again is when you watch the Big Three out there, it's interesting because Robinson's never played them before, but Lapointe and Savard have.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of, and even people forget, like Don Orey was one of the Montreal defensemen, and he had played in 72 as well. So, I mean, I think the fact they kept it to 13 shots says something, but the fact that of the 13, I mean, they had 3 odd man rushes the whole game, and they scored on all 3.
Jeez.
Like, so, now, it's when you when you sit there and closely watch the game, you kind of go, holy gee, they're just so efficient, and that's part of the deal, right?
Yeah. Now, in that 72 Summit Series, the early games, Dryden really got shellacked bad. Did he do any type of readjustments for the 75 game as opposed to what he did in 72? Did he do any type of readjusting of his game, of his style?
I don't know that he did, and I mean, he people forget this too. Like, he does get kind of a bad rap, and people remember obviously Game 1 and the early games. But, I mean, he does win Game 6 in Moscow, which is, of course, a must-win. Yeah. And a pretty nail-biting Game 6, like a tense Game 6.
Yeah.
And then people also tend to overlook in Game 8 that, I mean, they went into the third period with Team Canada down 5-3. I mean, he can't give up a goal. He goes out for that third period. He cannot give up a goal. And to his credit, he doesn't.
Wow.
And, I mean, I don't think people give him enough credit for the Game 6 and 8 in Moscow, in particular the third period of Game 8. But even going back to Game 6, I mean, Tony Esposito played well, obviously. I don't think, but they went to Dryden in Game 8. You know what I mean? It's funny. Now, with regards to the 75 game, it's tough because he's only got 13 shots.
Wow.
And they're all high quality. Like, they're all, I said, 3 odd man rushes, they score on all 3. He did have trouble. He always seemed to have trouble against them, and people always mentioned it on the side-to-side, you know? The side-to-side. They always seem to get him on the side-to-side, you know, post-to-post. So when you look at, but if you look at the 3 goals they score, they're not 3 bad goals. I mean, they're not like where you go, oh my God. It's just, I mean, there was no person perhaps more crushed by the end result than him. Let's just put it that way. He was perhaps the one who took that the hardest.
We now talk about your third book, A Season in Time, and what a beautiful masterpiece it is. What led you to deal with that specific season, Todd?
Okay, so that one, again, as I said, first one was a bio, second one was an event, and then, you know, that one is one where you kind of were, I was influenced by this thought of doing a book on a season. So we talked earlier, a big influence on that was David Halberstam had done 2 books, one called Summer of 49 and one called October 64, which kind of took a look at a season. And then even at that time, there were some other books coming out that had focused on a year, particularly the baseball ones. There's a whole whack of them now, but like books on, you know, this season and that season. So I kind of thought to myself, well, okay, which hockey season? And for me, like, full disclosure, like 92, 93, I turned 18 that year. So that was like my last year of high school. It's hard for people who didn't live through that to imagine, especially growing up in southern Ontario, that spring was like, for example, the playoffs, that was the year that, like, for example, the Leafs made it all the way to within a goal of the final. That was the year they played the 21 games in 41 nights or whatever. And the nights they weren't on was the nights that Montreal played. So that was kind of the setup. And, I mean, even now, you know, that was such a big deal at the time because you're of that age. But, I mean, I would argue, and, you know, everything's debatable, but when you talk about an overall playoff, like a playoff where, 92-93 has got to be up there. I mean, you have the Montreal run with the 10 overtimes, the Leafs with the 7-game series is all the way. You've got Gretzky reemerging, and people forget that going into the playoffs, the Penguins, who had won the last 2 cups, were as big a cup favorite going into the playoffs as there was in recent memory. I mean, maybe Tampa being upset last year, but Pittsburgh going in, Mario had come back, and of course you had the cancer thing that year, and Gretzky's year his career was thought to be in doubt. There was just, once you started in my mind thinking about it, I started going, okay, wow, we've got that story, and then the concern is, oh my God, do I have too much here to put it all in one book? Because there was just so many angles going on, you know, and so, like, I mean, you have the last time Montreal and Quebec met in the playoffs, and, I mean, there's just so many things going on. You had the Dale Hunter suspension with Pierre Turgeon, and then during that season, it's just, you know, so, but then you start going, okay, there's a lot of meat here. There's enough for a book. And I think part of it was because I'd lived it, I kind of knew where to go with that one in terms of how to build the structure of the book, because I'd lived it. I knew where I wanted to get at the end, middle, and I thought, okay, I know what was important because I lived it.
Now, you talk about structure of the book. You just anticipated my next question. One of your great, and this is my opinion, one of your great strengths as an author is the way you construct your books. In my opinion, you have a great sense of architecture when it comes to constructing your chapters and getting them to be the right size, not too short, not too long. How did you develop that skill? I mean, I think for other people who like to be an author, especially me, I'd love to learn. What's your secret, Todd? How do you do it?
So when I think of structure, you always kind of have to keep okay, where am I going? So and part of it is it's kind of selfish in that you kind of have to make the decision, obviously, to go, this is what's important, this is what isn't. What are people going to really focus on and what isn't? And so you're kind of brutal in that way. Like you cut things and go, we'll focus on this, but this is really what we really want to spend a lot of time on in words. Basically, I'm one of those people who I'm very linear, point A to point B to point C. It's got to go here, here, here. I try not to jump around too much. Because I find that can sometimes get confusing. I try not to sit. Also, as a writer, I try to keep it going. I try to avoid going backwards. Sometimes it's a temptation to kind of go ahead a bit and then back. I try and avoid that at all costs. Always go forward, but also knowing, okay, what are the themes here? What's the, so like, for example, in Season and Time, one of the interesting things in that book is that was really a disappointing year for the New York Rangers. The Rangers came into that year Cup favorites, and they don't even make the playoffs. But I know the next year they win the Cup. So without referring to it, I'm guessing that the reader's going to know that too. So I purposely put in some Ranger stuff in the book. I think I have a chapter even on them of how disappointing their year was.
Yeah.
Because it's also the way to bring in the Islanders.
Yeah.
Because nobody saw that coming. So you kind of go, okay, that's disappointing, and then here's the surprise. But then everybody who's reading the book who's a hockey fan knows that the Ranger thing, the payoff for them is the next year. So it's kind of, structure-wise, it's like, okay, where do you put this? Where do you put this? Like, for example, everybody's got to get to where they get in the book. So Greatest Game, structure-wise, I know the game's important. I know there's a lot of hype about it. But as a writer, I'm always doing this in my head. Why? Why? Why is it important? Why was there a lot of hype? And that kind of is how I structure the book, is I'm answering the question of why. So in the back of my head, people are always going, well, why this? Why was Jacques Plante an innovator? Why was Jacques Plante important? Why? Always answering the questions like why or what, why, what, and always questioning it and thinking you're giving the answer. And kind of that's how I structure it.
Now, you were talking about the Islanders, and one of my favorite moments in that book when reading it is when the Islanders, was it against the Penguins or was it against the first round, the Caps, when Al Arbor, I think they lost that first game, and then he thought they were playing lackadaisical, so he told the bus driver to get out of the bus, shut the door, and he blew the whole walls out, and he got the Islanders. In other words, don't be content just to be in the playoffs. I expect you to win. And who was it, Ray Ferraro you interviewed? Who told that story? Oh, that was such a great moment. And what impressed me is that this is another one, in my opinion, this is another one of your great strengths as an author. You have the ability to ask the right questions where you can get your interview subjects to open up and give you those tiny little colors, those tiny little facets that really make your diamond books sparkle and shine incredibly. You get those little vignettes where you feel like you're in the locker room, you're right next to Gretzky, or you're listening to late Pat Burns motivate the Leafs, or you're listening to Jacques. You're in the locker room when they're measuring Marty McSorley's stick. How do you do it, Todd? How are you able to ask those beautiful questions?
So part of it is if you research the topic and you know what you're talking about, when you're interviewing these guys, they get the sense, if you're lucky, that, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. And part of it is when I tend to interview people, I try to make it like a conversation because I find that loosens people up. I'll write out questions, but I'm not sitting there just asking question. I kind of try to incorporate it into a conversation. And if you can make it a little bit lighter, and I tend to as well, sometimes I think a mistake people make is if you have somebody who's talking and they're talking, let them keep talking. In other words, you want their insight, right? So the more they talk, the more they're going to open up. So I think for Season in Time, I know that I probably did. I think I talked for probably at least 4 hours with Jacques Demers over a couple days.
Wow.
And just let him talk, because Jacques, for example, is a big personality. Jacques wants to get a lot of stuff out. So just let Jacques talk. And sometimes you may even get 5 minutes of stuff where you're like, okay, it's not really. And then all of a sudden, something kicks in. Like Ray Ferraro. Ray Ferraro was excellent because the more I talked to Ray, he'd be like, whoa, did anybody tell you this? Or did you hear about this? Or I remember this. And those are the ones you get. People quite often, I find, especially in the sports books, get too wrapped up in the stats part of it. Again, this is part of, so I know that Gretzky, for example, scores the hat trick in Game 7. I know that. Yeah. We all know that. But I want the stuff beyond that. So when I asked Gretzky, who's very humble, I said, the hat trick, and I said the one where the goal where you banged it in off of Dave Elliot's skate from behind the net, you banked it in. So Gretzky goes to me, that was luck, I got lucky, and that's typical Wayne. He's very humble. I remember talking to Todd Gill about it, and so I mentioned, Wayne told me that he was just lucky and all that, and Todd Gill was very blunt and goes, no, he's full of. I said, really? He goes, I'm telling you, he came behind the net and his eyes were locked, and he saw Elliott skate. I can still see his eyes looking at Elliott skate. Did it on purpose. He knew what he was doing. I saw the way he did. I saw him play. So those are the types of things where if you're on the ball, you're going, okay, there's what I want. That's what I want. So you can have Gretzky being humble, and then the other side of it is Todd Gill going, no, come on. He knew what he was doing. He's Wayne Gretzky, da-da-da-da. So you get those moments, and part of that I find that helps is when you're doing the interviews is just listening. You're interviewing them. I mean, I don't need to tell them what happened. They lived it. My job is to kind of dig it a bit and get it to come out. And doing that for me is always trying to make people feel comfortable when they're talking to me.
When you were investigating the Marty McSorley stick incident, that was the key turning point to the 1993 Stanley Cup Finals. Were you surprised by what you uncovered, or did you always know all along? I mean, can you tell us how you investigated the Marty McSorley stick incident?
Well, it was funny with that one because on that one, I knew going in that was going to be a big focus. Yeah. So again, part of this is interviewing people. So on that book, I interviewed, I guess it was close to maybe 20 people involved with the Kings that year. Yeah. In terms of players, trainer, coaches, all that. And I'd interviewed, I guess, maybe 15 or so Montreal guys. Gee. Plus I interviewed Kerry Fraser. Ooh. And then you have the media guys. So it's because once you start getting the pieces, right? Yeah. So in terms of the stick thing, some guys on LA were reluctant to talk about it. obviously Marty had his story that he wanted out there. And,
Yep.
I mean, Luc Robitaille was pretty open about it, too. And then the Montreal guys. And, I mean, that was one of those things where there was a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
And the main thing I thought was I want to give Marty, because ultimately it's him with the stick.
Yeah.
I want to give Marty's story. This is Marty's story.
Yeah.
And then we'll go from there, because you can get down into the foxhole and into the weeds quite a bit, because there's a whole bunch of stuff there that has a conspiratory thing to it and all this. But the basic thing, like, I knew the outlines of it in that nobody disputed that Marty had an illegal stick.
Yep.
That's not in dispute. The question is how did Montreal find out about it and all this? And you talk to Kirk Muller, you talk to Guy Carbonneau, you kind of, in the book, it really outlines how it is. I mean, the part that really stuck with me, actually, and this was before his own book came out. I mean, poor Kerry Fraser, he's involved that year in the Gilmore Gretzky incident in Game 6 in L.A., and then less than a week later, he's got the illegal stick. It's just funny how that goes. And his story of how he told the thing, where they called for the illegal stick, and how he went up to Marty and asked for the stick, and Marty just kind of gave it to him, and he, as he says, as soon as he saw it, he knew.
Yeah.
He knew, and his way of telling Marty's reaction to it, and then him skating over, and Fraser doing the measurement, because he knew where the TV camera was at the Forum, so that the measurement could be seen by everybody, because he didn't want this to be messed up.
Yeah.
And then him with Gretzky behind him waiting for the verdict, and him turning to Wayne and just kind of giving him the look, and him describing the look on Wayne's face. I mean, as a writer, that's easy to write. They've told me the story. They've given me the whole thing. It's just a matter of me getting it down. But that's where, again, it's all about listening to people when they tell you stuff and trying to pick out and go, okay, you have that feeling, I do at least, where I'm like, okay, this is gold. A good example of that is in the second book, Greatest Game. I remember interviewing Serge Savard, and I asked him if he'd watched the Flyer Red Army game. Yeah. And he gave me a whole description of how he was at home, and he watched it, and what he thought about it, or how little he thought of it. And it was so well said that you went to yourself, like right away, subconsciously you went, perfect, that's going to be the end of that chapter right there. Like you're very fortunate sometimes as a writer to have those moments where even before you write it, we're talking about putting the books together, where you go to yourself, okay, that's going right there in the book. And there's another one in Season and Time. There's a couple. Off the top of my head, I remember the Jacques Demers interview and his portion of coming back to Montreal after they lost the first two games to Quebec in the first round, and him bringing Patrick Waugh into the room and that conversation, and you're going to yourself, okay, wow. Like these are the things you don't see if you watch the games. You don't know. So that's what I'm always looking for, because like you would know as well, and you're reading the Season Time, Montreal beat Quebec.
Yep.
You don't know that behind-the-scenes stuff. And that's kind of what makes your book stand out, is having those. And when you get those moments, and again, it sounds maybe a little bit selfish, but when I hear something that I haven't heard before, I figure that a lot of other people haven't heard it, right away I go, perfect, I've got that. And that's the gratifying feeling, because once you have it, it's just a matter of putting it, typing it out. But you have it.
Okay. In your book, Unbreakable, you collaborated with Mike Brophy. What led to this collaboration? And, why did you write about Unbreakable? What led to that project?
Okay, so that one, Mike had the idea for the book.
Ooh.
Mike and I shared the same agent at the time.
Okay.
And I got along well with Mike. Mike and I had a bit of a history before that, and we still get along really well. And basically the thought behind, Mike had the idea, and Mike wanted to do the book, and he was asked if I could help out with some of that. And what that basically evolved into was a kind of a nice little co-writing thing where I did most of the research, Mike did most of the interviews, and then Mike basically wrote the first draft of the book, and then the second draft was pretty much me going over Mike's first draft and adding pieces here and there. So like really a collaborative book, but the idea was Mike's, and the structure was kind of something Mike and I had talked about, in that if you're going to do it on the 50 and 39, you got to do it game by game.
Yeah.
And some games aren't as eventful as others. So on the ones that aren't as eventful, those are the ones where you can use those games to bring in some, quote-unquote, the background to the story. Because I think part of that book was there's the record, and there's Gretzky doing something that's so ridiculous at the time, like just beyond people's expectation level. But I also think the underlying theme of that book is this was the moment where Gretzky became wow. Before that, you still had critics who would go, oh, well, he's not as good an all-around player as Brian Trottier, or, Mike Bossy is this. And I really wanted to point out, because that year starts off with Gretzky losing in the Canada Cup. And it's really that moment at first, like that first loss, like he comes into the NHL and wins the scoring title and he's doing all this, but the 81 Canada Cup is kind of the critics' fodder of, oh, wow, come on, he's not that, look at this. And, of course, the way that ended. And then when he does the 50 and 39, you can't, the critics all of a sudden, it's so ridiculous, the accomplishment, and so beyond, that all of a sudden, it's the moment where he goes from being one of the best players. And when you go through the old hockey newses or the old hockey magazines, you'll see articles before that year, leading up to that year, of who's hockey's best player and or who's this. After the 50 and 39, and then by extension the end of the year, where he's got breaks the goal record and the point record and the 200 points, there are no articles. There are no features about who's the best. He's the guy. And then you also see in the process I wanted to put in also how he becomes like kind of like, this is where you start seeing the merchandising, him with the products, him becoming larger than life. And I mean, the one thing that stuck with me, again, and you get these, I don't know, but when you research your book and you research stuff, some of the stuff you knew, but some of the stuff kind of reinforces, and you kind of you come across something. And the one that got me was the press conference in Toronto after he'd done the 50 and 39, where they held it at the Royal York, and there was like 200 media there, and it was just like, I was like going, okay, this is like really a wow moment, like, holy geez, like he's really become this big deal. And I thought that's kind of what we want to get into, is how he goes from being star to superstar to like Wayne Gretzky, which arguably is a position that he still holds today, much like Bobby Orr becoming Bobby Orr.
Yeah. Now the thing is, if you and Mike's analysis, what was it that led to the 50 and 39? Was it a good pairing? He had good line mates. I mean, was he put it all together? This was his year. I mean, how do you explain 50 goals in 39 games? What happened? What was the backstory behind that? Based on your and Mike's interpretation.
Yeah, well, the funny thing with that is, and again, when you read the introduction to that book, one of the things is, one of the things that makes Gretzky unique, and this is probably true of the really great players, is they're not satisfied with being great. So in his second year, Gretzky sets the assist record. He wins the scoring title. He sets the single-season assist record. And most people would be like, hey, I'm on top of the world. I'm great. And Gretzky, on the other hand, goes, I think I'm getting too predictable. Everybody thinks I'm going to pass all the time. I should probably shoot more. I mean, only a guy, keep in mind, too, this is coming from a 20-year-old kid. He's going to himself, I got to adapt my game a bit. I'm not shooting enough. I'm getting too predictable, after he sets the single-season assist record. So he starts shooting the puck more. The funny thing is you hear a lot, people always mention, you never see, like when people go, the game's greatest goal scorers, obviously Ovechkin currently gets a lot of ink, and, obviously Bobby Hull, people think of him with goals, or Espo. It's funny how Gretzky just isn't, he's always thought of as a playmaker, but nobody ever really says goal guy. Meanwhile, he holds every significant single-season, playoffs, career goal record is him, right? Yeah. It's almost the one part of his career or the one part of his game that's the almost, I don't want to say least appreciated, but the least remarked upon. One of the things, too, with that's interesting is you can go on YouTube, and the night that he breaks Esposito's record, the Buffalo night, the game in Buffalo, there's a great, 10-minute YouTube clip. He's literally robbed. Don Edwards robs him about 4 times in that game.
Wow.
Just amazing stops. And it's it's not going to be tonight. And even later on, when we talk to Wayne, just some nights you don't and whatever. And when you see the first goal that he scores, you literally have to watch it 2 or 3 times to appreciate it's so quick. It is literally, it's out of nowhere. Takes puck, steals it, boom, goal in the net. That's Gretzky. That's the genius of him, in that you have to almost rewind it and watch it again to appreciate it. That year, and people always, one of my fonder Gretzky memories, people always talk about, this play or that play. That goal against Calgary in Game 2 of the 88 Smythe playoffs, in the Smythe finals there, that shorthanded goal in overtime, the slap shot goal.
Yeah.
How many guys, that goal, when you watch it, how many guys make that play? That's a goal scorer's goal. That's a goal scorer. So, that's to me, the subtle change from going, I'm getting too predictable, and then all of a sudden, it just started. Again, the other thing, too, is people forget, he scored, to get the 50 and 39, he was actually 41 and 37. Wow. In the 38th game, he scored 4 goals against the Kings, and then the 39th game against Philly, he scored 5. So he scored 9 goals in 2 games to get to the 50 and 39. So, I think part of what made that book really intriguing for me, and I know this is where Mike had the seed of the idea, was when they asked Gretzky, because he still has 61 NHL records, and they said, well, which one do you think is going to be the toughest to break? And I'm, let's be honest. Nobody's going to touch the point record, the assist record for the career. There's just ridiculous records. Yeah. But he pointed out the 1539, and when you start thinking about it and you start doing the math, especially in today's game, guys we may get what is it every year? You get maybe one guy, maybe 2, score 50 in 82 games.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Todd, last question. In recent years, you've been battling health issues. It's kind of kept you on the bench in terms of your writing career. How are you feeling today, and when can we expect another one of your brilliant efforts, another brilliant book on your part? When can we expect your next work?
Well, thank you for the kind wishes. I don't think it's, as you said, I don't think it's much of a secret that I had quite a bit of a health setback there a few years ago. Still have some things to deal with, but generally, I'm as good as I've been, since I got sick. For those of you who maybe don't know, I had a little bit of an experience with cancer and some related stuff like that, but knock on wood, everything's good now. So I have been researching my next book. The one thing, as I said, is it's funny. The first book with Jacques Plante was a biography. Second book was an event. Third book was a season. And really the fourth book was about a record. Yeah. So I've been missing. I've wanted to do biography.
Yeah.
The Jacques Plante, like a cradle to grave biography. But again, it's finding who to do one on.
Yeah.
And like, what's the subject that hasn't been done? And I think I've stumbled upon something where I know it hasn't been done.
Okay.
It's a little bit older. It's a little bit more historical. But
Ooh.
I've been researching it now for about a year.
Ooh.
A lot of research, a lot of material. But I hope to start writing it at some point this year. I guess the positive thing I could tell people is the reason I haven't started writing it is I tend to get all my research done first, and I keep finding cool little stuff that perhaps people wouldn't know. So as long as I keep finding these cool little things, I can't really start writing it until I get everything that I need. So I'm really, as I said, I'm working on it. It's a big one, though. It's a biography of 3 people, so that's a lot of work involved in doing a triple biography.
Ooh. When can we anticipate a potential release, Todd?
Oh, it depends. I wouldn't think before next year. Because as I said, I'm still doing the research, and then the writing's going to take some time. But
yeah,
I'm definitely got most
Todd?
of the research done.
Todd, hello.
Yep. Hello.
Todd.
Yeah.
Todd, hello.
Yeah. Hello.
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 Hello. Hello.
Todd.
Hello.
Todd, are you there? We lost you for a sec. Okay. Okay. So you figure like a couple years before release?
At the most.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
I can't wait. Yeah. Well, when it comes out, we're going to have you on again, okay, Todd?
Perfect. I would appreciate that.
Todd, may God bless and keep you always, and we can't wait. We eagerly anticipate your next release, and may God bless and keep you always, Todd.
Thank you so much, Matt. I greatly appreciate that.
Oh, it's a great honor, Todd. A great honor and a privilege.
Well,
you take care.
You as well.
Okay. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show, where I will be interviewing sports author and podcaster Chuck Banks. Thank you, and good night.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.